The night was not dark, it was glowing red. October 25th, 1944. The waters of Leyte Gulf boiled under a storm of American fire. From the deck of the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Nakajima stared into the inferno. Above him, the sky was shredded by tracer fire. Every second, a wave of U.S. Navy dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, their engines howling like mechanical banshees. Explosions lit the sea in violent flashes. The air reeked of burning oil and salt. Men shouted orders that vanished beneath the roar of detonations. Nakajima's hands trembled as he clutched the railing. He had survived Midway, the Solomons, and countless bombardments. But never had he seen power like this. From the horizon, Iowa-class battleships unleashed their 9 16-inch guns. The thunder rolled for miles, flattening the ocean with shock waves. Destroyers vanished in plumes of water and fire. For the first time, many Japanese officers understood. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was dying here, beneath an ocean of flame. And yet, this devastation had not come overnight. It was the result of years of ambition, strategy, and a growing American machine that refused to stop. The story of how the Pacific turned to fire begins long before Leyte. The German convoys that once filled the roads of France are long gone, but their memory remains, a silent testament to the moment when thunder ruled the heavens, and the world learned to fear the sound that followed. The story of Leyte's inferno began years earlier, in the calm before the storm. In the early 1930s, Japan stood as a rising empire. Its factories hummed with ambition. Its armies marched across Asia, and its leaders believed destiny had chosen them to dominate the Pacific. The nation's industrial might, though smaller than America's, was driven by a fierce, disciplined spirit, one that viewed war not as horror, but as honor. When Japan invaded China in 1937, few imagined it was only the beginning. Tokyo's imperial dream, a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, demanded control of the Pacific's vast resources. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the minerals of the Philippines, all were lifelines for Japan's growing war machine. But one obstacle stood in their way: the United States. By 1940, relations had turned cold. Washington imposed economic sanctions, cutting off vital oil supplies. Japan's leaders faced a fatal choice: retreat or strike. They chose the latter. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, battleships lay broken in the harbor's oily waters. Smoke curled into the sky as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's gamble paid its first dividend. America was stunned, its Pacific fleet crippled. For the next 6 months, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, capturing Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Singapore. Their pilots dominated the skies in agile Zero fighters. Their navy stretched from the Indian Ocean to the edges of Australia. In Tokyo, victory seemed ordained. Newspapers hailed Yamamoto as a genius. School children marched beneath banners proclaiming Japan's eternal supremacy. Even Western observers feared that the Pacific might soon belong to the emperor. But beneath the triumph, a shadow formed. The United States, humiliated but unbroken, began to awaken. Factories from Detroit to San Diego switched overnight from automobiles to aircraft, from tractors to tanks. The American industrial giant, once idle, now thundered with purpose. Ships rolled off assembly lines faster than Japan could sink them. New Essex-class carriers, Liberty ships, and submarines appeared every month. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military chiefs, Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz, crafted a long, unrelenting plan. Island by island, Japan would be driven backward. Meanwhile, Yamamoto understood what his politicians refused to see. He famously warned, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His words were prophecy. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, that prophecy began to take shape. At the remote atoll of Midway, U.S. Navy codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications and set an ambush. 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sent to the bottom within hours. The victory shocked the world. Japan's naval dominance cracked, and its most experienced aviators were lost. From that day forward, Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative. Still, the Imperial Navy fought on, fiercely, skillfully, but increasingly alone. American submarines strangled Japan's merchant shipping. Oil, ammunition, and food grew scarce. The vast empire Japan had seized began to crumble under its own weight. Yet for Japanese commanders, surrender was unthinkable. The code of Bushido, the samurai's creed, demanded perseverance unto death. Every loss only hardened their resolve. In Washington, however, the war was becoming mathematical. America's resources, manpower, and production outmatched Japan by staggering margins. Every new ship, every bomber, every trained crew widened the gulf. By late 1943, the U.S. Navy had transformed into something the world had never seen before. A floating industrial city, powered by radar, logistics, and endless supplies. The Pacific Ocean, once Japan's domain, now began to shift in color. From imperial crimson to American steel gray. And as Admiral Nimitz prepared his fleets for the next leap forward, one goal stood clear: to strike deep into Japan's empire and never look back. The first test would come in the Solomon Islands and the jungles of Guadalcanal, a brutal proving ground where flesh, metal, and will collided. From the ashes of Midway, a new kind of war was born, one that would carry both nations toward total destruction. By late 1942, the tides of war had begun to shift, slowly, brutally, but unmistakably. The Japanese Empire, once the master of the Pacific, now faced an enemy that refused to stop coming. The first real test came at Guadalcanal. What began as a small American landing in August 1942 turned into a 6-month bloodbath of attrition. In the dense jungles and shark-infested waters, Japanese troops fought to the last man, often starving before surrendering. For the U.S. Marines, victory came at a cost, but it proved one critical truth: the Imperial Army could be beaten. Guadalcanal marked the start of island hopping, a relentless American strategy designed to leapfrog across the Pacific, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and cutting them off one by one. Instead of frontal assaults on every island, U.S. commanders targeted strategic airfields, harbors, and supply routes. Each captured island became a new launch pad, bringing the U.S. Navy's carriers, bombers, and battleships closer to Japan's home waters. Meanwhile, Japan's naval strength began to erode. The loss of experienced pilots at Midway was irreplaceable. Training programs rushed unprepared recruits into cockpits, many with fewer than 100 flight hours. Against them stood swarms of newly trained American aviators flying advanced aircraft. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the TBF Avenger, and the rugged Corsair. Technology now dictated survival. The U.S. Navy had mastered radar, night operations, and coordinated air-sea tactics. Entire fleets could now move under the cover of darkness, guided by electronic eyes that Japan could neither match nor counter. In contrast, the Japanese Navy, once admired for its precision, began to rely on desperate gambles. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, The Empire's sprawling territories drained men and materials. The once invincible battleships Yamato and Musashi became symbols of pride, but also of futility. They were majestic, massive, and nearly useless in a war now dominated by carriers. By 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur had launched two simultaneous offensives, one driving through the Central Pacific, the other through the South Pacific. Island after island fell: Tarawa, the Marshalls, Saipan, and Guam. Each victory tightened the noose. In Tokyo, optimism turned to disbelief. Reports from the front grew darker: fleets lost, cities bombed, supply lines severed. Japanese commanders clung to hope that a decisive battle might yet turn the tide. But that hope was fading with every convoy sunk in the Philippine Sea. America's industrial dominance was now overwhelming. By 1944, the United States was launching a new aircraft carrier every few months. Battleships, cruisers, and submarines streamed across the Pacific like an endless tide of steel. Supply chains stretched from San Francisco to Manila, each link forged in the factories of a nation united by purpose. For Japan, each battle meant irreplaceable losses. For America, each loss could be replaced tenfold. The contrast could not have been sharper. On Japanese islands, soldiers dug into coral and jungle, living on rice and desperation. On American ships, sailors ate hot meals, listened to radio broadcasts, and sailed aboard floating fortresses equipped with radar, medicine, and fresh water. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was running on fumes, both literally and strategically. Its oil reserves were nearly gone. Every voyage required calculation: how much fuel could be spared, how many ships could be risked. The U.S. Navy, in contrast, had become a mobile armada of industry. Fleets of floating airfields and supply ships capable of refueling, repairing, and rearming in mid-ocean. It was no longer fighting just a war, it was running a machine that devoured the Pacific. Japan's admirals knew the truth. The coming battles would not be about victory, but about survival and honor. They resolved to meet the enemy head-on, no matter the cost. That cost would be paid in the waters of the Philippine Sea and later at Leyte Gulf, where the full power of American firepower would ignite the Pacific itself. And as the horizon filled with ships, Japan braced for the storm that would decide its fate. By 1944, the faces of Japan's Navy told the story better than any report could. They were young, painfully young. Many of the pilots who climbed into Zero fighters over the Philippine Sea were barely 20. Their eyes carried both pride and exhaustion. They had grown up under a banner of divine destiny, taught that dying for the emperor was the purest form of honor. But when the horizon filled with American fleets, carriers so vast they seemed to blot out the sea, that belief met reality. The Imperial Navy's veterans were gone, their experience lost at Midway, the Solomons, and countless smaller clashes. What remained were boys trained in haste, driven by faith more than skill. In cockpits and engine rooms, courage fought against terror. Some whispered prayers before takeoff. Others tied headbands marked with the rising sun, not as decoration, but as quiet promises to die bravely. They faced enemies they could barely see, radar-guided, faster, deadlier. For every Japanese pilot who launched, 10 American aircraft waited. For every destroyer Japan sent to sea, 5 more U.S. ships awaited on the horizon. Yet still, they fought. The same scene unfolded aboard American decks, but with a different rhythm. The crews of the Essex-class carriers moved with mechanical precision, part of an immense, coordinated machine. When the order to launch came, Hellcats and Avengers rolled down the decks in perfect sequence. Every man had his role. Every action was timed to the second. For the Americans, this was not about personal glory. It was about endurance, teamwork, and overwhelming power. They didn't fight to die for their country. They fought to ensure they went home again. Amid the noise and steel, the Pacific War was becoming something neither side had fully prepared for. A test of humanity itself. The technological angle. Firepower forged in factories. Technology became destiny. By 1944, America's shipyards were producing more tonnage each month than Japan had built in an entire year. The Essex-class carriers were floating fortresses, each capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and guided by radar systems that could detect enemies long before they appeared. Above them, the F-6F Hellcat dominated the skies. Rugged, fast, and heavily armed, it became the angel of death for Japanese aviators. Its 650 caliber Browning guns could tear through a zero in seconds. And unlike their Japanese counterparts, American pilots had months of training, radios for coordination, and the security of superior numbers. The sea itself became a weapon. The Iowa-class battleships, sleek and immense, could hurl 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles. Each salvo shook the horizon, flattening islands and shattering defenses. To Japanese sailors watching from the decks of their destroyers, these bombardments felt almost supernatural. Thunder from across the sea. Then came the submarines. Silent, unseen, merciless. U.S. submarines strangled Japan's supply lines, sinking freighters, tankers, and troop transports. By late 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Without oil, ships lay idle. Without food, garrisons starved. Even in the air, technological evolution tilted the balance. The B-29 Superfortress, with its pressurized cabin and immense range, could strike Japan's home islands from thousands of miles away. For the first time, the Japanese homeland, once untouchable, lay within the reach of American fire. Japan, by contrast, was trapped in the limits of its own innovation. Its engineers were brilliant, but resources were scarce. Fuel was rationed, steel was short, and production slowed under constant bombing. The Imperial Navy's last hope rested on a few massive warships, symbols of pride in a war that no longer had room for pride. Technology was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy. America fought with machines, logistics, and calculation. Japan fought with spirit, sacrifice, and resolve. But in the Pacific, faith alone could not stop radar-guided shells or waves of carrier-based bombers. And as Japanese commanders watched their fleets vanish beneath columns of black smoke, they began to understand a painful truth. The war they had prepared for no longer existed. The battle was no longer about bravery or belief. It had become a contest of strategy, leadership, and the last threads of hope. The tactical angle. The logic of annihilation by 1944, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of chance. It was a chessboard, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was its quiet, calculating master. From his command center in Pearl Harbor, he directed fleets that spanned thousands of miles, each move designed not just to win battles, but to collapse Japan's entire war structure. The American strategy was elegant in its brutality. Island hopping. Instead of attacking every fortress Japan had built, Nimitz bypassed the strongest and seized only the islands that mattered. Those with airfields, fuel depots, or naval anchorages. Every captured island became a forward base. Every bypassed island became a tomb. Cut off from supplies, Japanese garrisons starved, isolated, but still defiant. Each offensive moved the U.S. Navy closer to Japan's heart. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Every leap shortened the flight time of bombers and stretched Japan's defenses thinner. But what made Nimitz's campaign truly devastating was his mastery of coordination. He synchronized air, sea, and land like a single organism. Submarines scouted ahead. Carrier task forces struck from beyond the horizon. Amphibious fleets landed under protective curtains of naval gunfire. And above it all, U.S. reconnaissance planes mapped every movement, every hidden gun, every convoy that dared to move. The Japanese, bound by rigid doctrine, struggled to adapt. Their communications lagged, their radar was primitive, and their pilots were inexperienced. They sought decisive face-to-face clashes, but Nimitz refused to give them one. He fought with patience, precision, and an understanding that numbers would finish what courage began. By mid-1944, the Japanese command realized it was being outmaneuvered, not just outgunned. The U.S. Navy's tactics had turned the Pacific into a killing field of logic and mathematics. A war fought by machines, fueled by factories, and orchestrated by men who never saw their enemies' faces. The leadership angle, calm minds, collapsing empires in the Pacific War. Leadership meant everything, and it revealed everything. On one side stood Admiral Chester Nimitz, composed, analytical, and almost serene. He rarely raised his voice, never sought the spotlight, and led with the quiet assurance of a man who trusted both his men and his machines. He believed in delegation, in data, and in discipline. Under his command, chaos became coordination. Facing him was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most brilliant strategist, a man who had studied at Harvard, traveled America, and understood its power better than most of his superiors ever would. Yamamoto had opposed the war with the U.S., warning that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict. But when ordered to lead, he obeyed, and orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's genius was tactical brilliance. His curse was political obedience. When his warning came true, he watched helplessly as his fleet was ground down piece by piece. His death in 1943, ambushed by American fighters after his itinerary was decoded, marked the end of Japan's golden age of naval leadership. After Yamamoto, Japan's admirals struggled to unify. Some demanded one last decisive battle. Others sought defensive endurance. Rivalries fractured their command. Orders were delayed, countermanded, or simply lost in the fog of war. In contrast, Nimitz's structure grew only stronger. Beneath him worked men like Admiral Raymond Spruance, known for his calm intellect, and Admiral William Bull Halsey, famous for his aggression and fire. Together, they represented a balance Japan could no longer match. Precision and fury working in harmony. While Japanese commanders fought with desperation, American leaders fought with patience. That difference defined the outcome. The moral angle, the cost of fire victory in the Pacific, was not clean. It came soaked in blood and smoke. As U.S. forces advanced, the human cost escalated. On islands like Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, told by propaganda that Americans would torture them, leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. On both sides, mercy grew scarce. The Japanese fought with suicidal resolve, and Americans learned to expect it. Flamethrowers, grenades, and naval bombardments became standard tools of survival. Civilians, soldiers, and sailors alike were consumed in the same storm. By 1944, the war had evolved beyond strategy. It had become total, a clash of philosophies. Japan's leaders saw surrender as dishonor. America saw delay as death. Each bombing raid, each naval strike, was designed not just to destroy, but to break will. In Tokyo, the word kamikaze, divine wind, entered the lexicon of war. Young men volunteered to die by crashing their planes into American ships. To them, it was sacrifice. To the Americans watching their decks erupt in fire, it was horror. There were no victors in these moments, only survivors. The Pacific burned because neither side would yield, and the line between valor and annihilation blurred completely. Out of these angles, human, technological, tactical, and moral, emerged the defining moment of naval warfare, when Japan's proud fleets sailed into the jaws of extinction at the Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Navy stood poised for the blow that would shatter Japan's naval air arm forever. The target, the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Their capture would bring American bombers within striking distance of Tokyo itself. Japan understood what that meant. Losing the Marianas meant losing the war. To defend them, Japan gathered what remained of its naval power. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the combined fleet's mobile force, 9 carriers, 473 aircraft, and the last hope of Japan's naval aviation. Yet beneath the surface of this mighty fleet lay a fatal weakness: the pilots. Most were rookies, young, undertrained, and terrified. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway were gone. The replacements had flown barely a few dozen hours. Their planes were older models, lighter, and underarmed. Radar, the unseen weapon that guided American defenses, was still largely absent from Japanese ships. Facing them was Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 67 destroyers, and more than 900 aircraft. His carriers formed a living wall of steel across the Philippine Sea. Spruance's mission was simple: protect the invasion of Saipan, and if the Japanese fleet appeared, destroy it utterly. On the morning of June 19, 1944, the Japanese struck first. Hundreds of planes lifted off from Ozawa's carriers, filling the sky with the rising sun insignia. They formed attack waves aimed at Spruance's fleet, believing surprise was on their side. They were wrong. American radar picked up the incoming aircraft more than 100 miles away. Hellcat fighters scrambled into the sky in perfect formation, guided by radar operators calling vectors from their ships below. What followed was slaughter. The U.S. pilots, seasoned and confident, tore through the Japanese formations with devastating efficiency. The Hellcats' heavier armor and superior speed left the Zeros helpless. Within hours, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Entire squadrons wiped from the sky before they could reach American ships. One U.S. pilot described it later with chilling simplicity. It was like shooting turkeys at a carnival. The phrase stuck: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Those Japanese aircraft that did reach their targets found a wall of anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. Battleships and cruisers unleashed torrents of flak shells, creating dense clouds of metal that filled the air with fire. Few attackers survived the approach. Fewer still returned. The summer's defeat at the Philippine Sea left Japan's navy crippled, its carriers afloat but empty, its pilots gone. Yet in Tokyo, surrender was still unthinkable. Japan's war planners convinced themselves there was one last chance. A single, decisive battle that might break the American advance and force a negotiated peace. That hope now rested on Leyte Gulf. In October 1944, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur began his long-promised return to the Philippines. Hundreds of American ships filled the waters off Leyte Island, landing tens of thousands of troops. Japan could not allow it. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the vital oil of the Dutch East Indies, the empire's lifeblood. The Imperial Navy, though battered and diminished, was ordered to sea for one last, desperate strike. The plan was bold and suicidal. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail north with a decoy fleet of mostly empty carriers to lure the American Third Fleet away. Meanwhile, 3 separate Japanese forces, the Central, Southern, and Northern groups, would converge on Leyte Gulf, attack the vulnerable invasion fleet, and annihilate it. The plan's name was Shogo, Operation Victory. October 23, 1944, the Sibuyan Sea. The U.S. fleet struck first. Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful central force, including the massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, came under relentless attack from waves of American carrier aircraft. Dive bombers and torpedo planes rained destruction from the sky. The Musashi fought like a floating fortress, taking more than 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits before she finally capsized, sending over 1,000 men to their graves. Even as she sank, Kurita pressed onward toward Leyte, battered but unbroken. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey's U.S. Third Fleet took the bait. Believing Ozawa's northern carriers to be Japan's main strike force, Halsey raced northward with his fast carriers and battleships, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. It was exactly what Japan had hoped for. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's battleships, including the Yamato, the largest ever built, emerged unexpectedly off Samar Island, where only a small U.S. escort group, Taffy 3, stood in their path. What followed was one of the most heroic actions in naval history. The American escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts were hopelessly outgunned. Tin cans, facing giants. But instead of fleeing, they attacked. Destroyers like Johnston, Hull, and Herman charged the Japanese line at full speed, launching torpedoes at point-blank range and laying down smoke screens to protect the carriers. Their guns spat fire, shells bouncing off Japanese armor. Pilots from the tiny escort carriers made repeated bombing and strafing runs, some even attacking without ammunition, dropping flares and making dummy runs to distract the enemy. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston fought until his ship was torn apart by shellfire. His last recorded order, "We're going in. Give 'em hell." Against all odds, the courage of Taffy 3 confused Kurita. Believing he was facing the main U.S. fleet, he hesitated, then withdrew. The invasion at Leyte was saved, but elsewhere, the sea was burning. In the Surigao Strait, Admiral Nishimura's southern force sailed into a deadly trap. Waiting for him was Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's line of American battleships, including veterans of Pearl Harbor, now resurrected and hungry for revenge. At night, the Americans executed the classic naval maneuver Japan had once perfected, crossing the T. Searchlights cut through the darkness as radar-directed guns opened fire. Within minutes, the Japanese battleships Yamashiro and Fuso were reduced to flaming wrecks. It was the last time battleships would ever duel each other in history. Meanwhile, Ozawa's northern decoy fleet finally met Halsey's wrath. His carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were sent to the bottom. Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, went down with her flag flying and her crew saluting. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, 4 engagements across hundreds of miles, was over. It was the largest naval battle ever fought, and Japan's last. In just 3 days, the Imperial Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Its ability to fight at sea was gone forever. But the true horror was yet to begin. As Japan's remaining commanders watched their ships vanish beneath the waves, a grim new weapon appeared: the kamikaze. Young pilots, many barely out of training, were now ordered to crash their planes directly into American ships. 1 plane, 1 ship, they were told. The first organized kamikaze strikes began during Leyte Gulf, and they shocked even the Americans hardened by years of war. On October 25, 1944, a kamikaze slammed into the carrier St. Lo, igniting its bomb magazines and sending it to the bottom. The first major ship sunk by suicide attack. Soon, the skies were filled with these human bombs, diving from the sun in flames of glory and despair. To the Japanese high command, it was proof of honor unto death. To the Americans, it was madness. The seas off Leyte glowed with burning oil and wreckage, the graves of thousands of sailors from both sides. The waters of the Pacific, once blue and endless, turned black with smoke and fuel. By the end of October, Japan's navy no longer existed as a fighting force. Its surviving ships limped back to home ports, short of fuel, short of men, short of hope. The carriers that had once terrorized the Pacific were now empty hulls, anchored in silence. Japan had lost the war at sea, and yet the word surrender could still not be spoken. Even in defeat, Japan's leaders clung to the dream of dying with honor. They would fight on, with the army, with the air force, with civilians if necessary. The empire of the rising sun had entered its final desperate phase, and soon the war would come home, to the skies over Tokyo itself. By evening, the Pacific was strewn with wreckage. The Japanese fleet had lost the equivalent of its entire pre-war air arm in a single day. The U.S. lost fewer than 30 planes in combat. But Spruance wasn't finished. At dawn on June 20th, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carrier Lexington, ordered his pilots to strike Ozawa's retreating fleet. It was late in the day, dangerously close to nightfall. But Mitcher took the risk. More than 200 aircraft launched, chasing the Japanese into the setting sun. They caught them just before dark. Bombs and torpedoes tore into Japanese carriers, Hiyo, Taiho, and Shokaku, each a veteran of earlier battles. Explosions ripped through their decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, vanished in a single blast that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. As night fell, the American pilots faced the hardest part, returning home in darkness, low on fuel. Mitcher made a decision that risked everything. He ordered his carriers to switch on their lights. It broke every rule of wartime protocol, but it saved hundreds of airmen from ditching into the sea. For hours, the horizon glowed with the soft, ghostly light of American ships guiding their men home. By the end of the battle, Japan's naval air power was finished. Of the 473 planes it had committed, nearly 400 were lost. Its remaining carriers were now empty. Ships without wings. Ozawa himself escaped, but his fleet was crippled beyond recovery. The Pacific belonged to the United States. But victory brought no pause. For Nimitz and his commanders, the next target was already clear: the Philippines. The path to Japan's homeland ran straight through Leyte Gulf. And it was there, only months later, that the remnants of Japan's navy would make one final, desperate stand in the largest naval battle in human history. The strategic collapse. The empire isolated by the end of 1944, the Pacific was no longer Japan's domain. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the rising sun, was now a ghost fleet. The might that had struck Pearl Harbor and swept through Southeast Asia lay rusting beneath the Pacific waves. For Japan, the sea, once its shield, had become a prison. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking tankers, troop transports, and merchant ships with ruthless precision. By early 1945, nearly 90% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. The empire was starving. No oil from the Dutch East Indies, no food from Southeast Asia, no hope of relief. Factories in Japan stood silent for lack of fuel. Airfields could no longer train new pilots. Battleships like Yamato sat idle at anchor, majestic but useless, their massive guns pointed toward a horizon they would never again cross. From the east, the American Armada advanced like a moving continent, an unending horizon of steel, aircraft, and firepower. The next target lay only 750 miles from Tokyo, Iwo Jima. February 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima. For 36 days, the island became a fortress of fire and ash. American Marines clawed their way up black volcanic sand under ceaseless Japanese gunfire. The defenders, 21,000 strong, fought from tunnels, bunkers, and caves, refusing surrender. Only a few hundred survived. The cost was staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead. Over 20,000 Japanese killed to the last man. But Iwo Jima's capture gave the U.S. what it needed. Airfields from which B-29 bombers could now reach the heart of Japan. The flames of war were moving ever closer. Next came Okinawa, the final stepping stone before the home islands. In April 1945, 2,500 American ships descended on Okinawa. What followed was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese, now desperate, unleashed wave after wave of kamikaze attacks, more than 1,900 suicide planes in just 2 months. The skies burned. Carriers were hit, destroyers sunk, sailors thrown into flaming seas. But the American fleet endured. On land, 100,000 Japanese soldiers fought to the death. Civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. Entire villages were consumed in the inferno. When the battle finally ended in June, Okinawa was a graveyard of nearly 250,000 souls, soldiers and civilians alike. Okinawa lay only 340 miles from Japan. The road to the homeland was now open. The imperial government knew what was coming next, and still they would not yield. And soon the fires of war would reach Tokyo itself, carried not by fleets, but by the wind and flame from the skies. The fires of the sky. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. By the spring of 1945, Japan was surrounded. Its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, its air force shattered, its armies cut off on distant islands. What remained was the homeland, scarred, starving, and bracing for invasion. But the Americans had no intention of storming Japan's shores just yet. They would burn the war out of existence. March 9–10, 1945, Tokyo. Just after midnight, the first wave of B-29 superfortresses appeared in the sky. They flew low, barely 5,000 feet. Their bomb bays filled not with explosives, but with napalm-filled incendiaries. The bombs opened in midair, scattering hundreds of small canisters that burst into sheets of liquid fire. Within minutes, Tokyo became an inferno. The city's wooden houses ignited like kindling. Flames raced through the narrow streets, consuming entire blocks in seconds. The heat melted asphalt, boiled canals, and tore oxygen from the air. People ran, screaming, their shadows seared into walls. In just 6 hours, 16 square miles of the city vanished. Over 100,000 civilians burned to death. More than at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the most destructive air raid in human history, and it was only the beginning. Over the next months, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, all were reduced to rubble. By July 1945, half of Japan's urban area was gone. Factories collapsed into ash. Rail lines melted. Hospitals and schools disappeared in flame. Still, Tokyo's leaders refused to surrender. Then, in August, the war reached its terrible climax. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomber, the Enola Gay, released an unfamiliar weapon, a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. A blinding white flash split the sky. In one instant, 70,000 people were vaporized. A black cloud rose 40,000 feet high, its shadow stretching for miles. The city ceased to exist. 3 days later, August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 lives ended in a heartbeat. Even as the ashes settled, another blow struck. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria and crushing the last remnants of the Kwantung Army. At last, even the most die-hard commanders realized the truth. There was nothing left to fight with, and nowhere left to run. September 6, 1945. Tokyo Bay, aboard the battleship USS Missouri. Under a gray, silent sky, Japanese envoys signed the formal instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the podium, his words calm but final. "It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." The ceremony lasted barely 20 minutes. Outside, the Pacific lay still. The same ocean that had burned, thundered, and swallowed fleets for 4 long years. Japan's empire was gone. The age of battleships and empires was over. And from those ashes, a new world was about to be born, one that would forever remember the fire that once turned the Pacific to flame. The Pacific War had begun with pride and ended in fire. What started at Pearl Harbor with the roar of carrier planes concluded aboard the Missouri in silence. In less than 4 years, the world had witnessed the transformation of warfare itself. The mighty battleships, once the symbols of national power, had become relics. The true rulers of the sea were now aircraft carriers, floating cities that could project destruction hundreds of miles away. The sky had become the new battlefield, and from it came both victory and horror. For Japan, the code of Bushido, honor in death, collided with the age of total war. Heroism gave way to annihilation. The kamikaze's sacrifice met the atomic flash. The code of the warrior was no match for the cold precision of modern firepower. Yet from the ruins, something remarkable emerged. The nation once driven by conquest turned to creation. The people who had built warships began building ships of trade. The engineers who designed bombers now crafted machines of peace. Cars, electronics, technologies that would reshape the modern world. And across the ocean, the United States, once Japan's mortal enemy, became its ally, protector, and partner. The fear that once defined them both transformed into respect, and then into cooperation that would anchor the Pacific for generations. But the lessons of that war remain. That pride, when fed by power, can blind even the wisest nations. That technology without conscience leads only to ruin. And that every flash of fire, every scream lost to the waves, carries a message written in flame. A warning to all who believe war can ever be controlled. The Pacific burned once. The world remembers so it never burns again.